Well, good morning, everybody. I have to say that I'm vastly intimidated by you all, and I hope that we'll be able to share something which will be of inspiration and of interest to all of us. First of all, can I ascertain that you're all hearing me all right? Thank you. I need to say two things. Firstly, that these are going to be devotional reflections rather than any sort of academic exegesis. So if any of you are New Testament scholars there, particularly in the Johannine writings, just go and make yourselves coffee. And the second thing is that regrettably I have to leave you at about 10 to 12 today because I need to catch a plane from Dublin to Edinburgh. So I'm relieved to hear Jill say that there isn't too much snow in Scotland at the moment. But to look at some of the women in John's Gospel and to see how the evangelist presents them to us. I find it absolutely fascinating reading John, because John's Gospel, of course, as we know, is very different to the Synoptic Gospels, and we don't need to go into what commentators call the synoptic problem. Let's just look at John. I think Luke's Gospel, and the writer Luke, is very often regarded as the person who is for and most sympathetic to women. But I personally would want to argue for John and for the women with whom he presents us. Another a feature of John's Gospel is that it's a gospel of dialogue. And I think very often, if we're invited to read the gospel in worship at any time, we become aware of this as we read, that there is give and take between Jesus and the people to whom he's speaking, not just women, but also with men. Another feature of John's Gospel is that it's a gospel with no parables. But many of the stories are what we might call parabolic. And as you know, the definition from our Sunday school was that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And that goes for the parables in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but I think it also goes for many of the stories in John's Gospel, because scripture historians will tell us, of course, that we can't count on the actual historical veracity of many of these stories, though there's likely to be a thread in it. But these stories are told for a purpose. And of course, John makes that very clear, that the stories he has chosen are there for a purpose. The very last verse of the Gospel reads, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Now, that's a bit overstated perhaps, but John was very excited about what he was recording. So as we look at the stories, these four stories of Mary of Nazareth, the Samaritan woman, Martha of Bethany, and Mary of Magdala, these are stories which were chosen by the evangelist for a very special purpose. And lastly, on the matter of John's Gospel, it's a gospel where women are presented as agents for evangelism, of people who, because of who they were, where they were people who could spread the good news. The women about whom we're going to be thinking over the next 4 weeks meet Jesus in different parts of Palestine. Mary of Nazareth, well, clearly met him in Nazareth, but also this story is based in Cana of Galilee, not so very far geographically from Nazareth. The Samaritan woman whom our Orthodox sisters and brothers refer to as Photine, meets him at Sychar in Samaria, foreign territory. Martha meets him in Bethany, a very small village outside Jerusalem. Mary of Magdala travels with him, but we'll meet her encountering him in the garden outside Jerusalem after the crucifixion. And though the accounts we will be reading are only found in John's Gospel, we'll refer every now and again to things in other Gospels. But today we're looking at Mary of Nazareth, and primarily at the story that we find in the second Gospel, the second chapter of the Gospel of John. But We find Mary mentioned in all four of the Gospel and at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles. She's in the first two chapters of Matthew, as well as in chapter 12 and 13. She's in Mark chapter 3 and chapter 6, in Luke chapter 1, 2 and 8, and in John, the two passages we'll look at today, John 2 and a couple of verses from John 19. And we find her referred to in Acts chapter 1 and verse 14. So she features in all four of the Gospels and in Luke's account of the Acts of the Apostles. And this particular story we're looking at today is an Epiphany story, both in the sense that it's the Gospel reading for the second Sunday of the Epiphany in year C, which is not this year, of course, this is year A, but also because it's a story, an Epiphany story with a lowercase e, something that shows forth Jesus, that tells us something more about Jesus. And we'll be looking at it and seeing what it has to tell us. But it's interesting to see how other people have interpreted the stories. And Ruth, could I have the first picture, please? The one from the Spanish painter Murillo. Yes, this is a painting by the Spanish painter Murillo. It's, sometime somewhere in the 15th, 16th, maybe 17th century. It's a typically Baroque picture. You can see it's a very a lot of people there at the wedding feast of various ages, both genders, and the bride is looking rather downcast. The groom is trying to look reassuringly at her, and there's Jesus with his right hand extended, pointing towards the 6 jars, which are being filled frantically by 2 servants and a little boy from Africa. And Jesus' mother is there beside him. It's interesting, and I always find it interesting to look at pictures of this period to see that there's a small dog there. Very often there's a small dog or a small cat in these pictures, and there's the dog. It's a typical Baroque painting, the wedding feast at Cana. And they are busy doing what Mary has told them to do. That is what Jesus says. Can we move on to the next one, the Chinese one, perhaps? Ruth? Thank you. This one is from a Chinese artist, He Qi, who started painting in the time of Mao, and in various accounts you have of his work, he says that during the day he painted for Mao, and during the evenings he painted for the gospel. And here you have the bride and the bridegroom toasting each other with someone in the background, we don't know, a typical emphasis on the red color of celebration that you find in Chinese paintings, and there are the servants pouring water into the big jars. Interestingly, on the left-hand side there, you'll see a small table with 5 loaves and 2 fishes on it. So what is He Qi saying to us here? His paintings show the gospel. He has many paintings, and some of you may have seen his books. Translate the gospel stories into the Chinese culture. So it'd be interesting sometime to reflect on why we have the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes there, as well as the water and the wine. And may we have the last one, please? This is a painting, a mural that I saw in the Anglican Cathedral in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, just a few weeks ago. It's it's a long mural, and I couldn't get it all in. But here are the 6 pots on the table, a dog underneath the table as well, please note, and Jesus pointing to the jars with 5 women filling the jars with the water. If you could see the bridegroom and the bride, they are dressed variously in Tamil and Sinhala clothing, and over to the other side, there are more guests. But it's a beautiful picture, and through the window at the back, you see the well from where the water is drawn, and you're drawn to think of the woman at the well as well. So it's a beautiful painting, and if you ever happen to be in Colombo, it's worth going to see, because the artist brings together factions which are normally at odds with each other in that community, bringing them together in this picture of a reconciling feast, a wedding. So thank you very much for those, Ruth. I'd be very grateful if someone would read the first text, which is John chapter 2.
Yes, it's me again. It's John chapter 2. Jesus changes water into wine. And I'm reading from the New International Version. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 80 to 120 litres. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He didn't realize that it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice of wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best wine until now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in.
Thank you, Michael. And the second reading is you, Ruth?
Sorry, just trying to unmute myself. Yes, this is from John chapter 19, verses 25 to 27, and I'm reading from the Revised English Bible. Meanwhile, near the cross on which Jesus hung, his mother was standing with her sister, Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. Seeing his mother with the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, Jesus said to her, "Mother, there is your son," and to the disciple, "There is your mother." And from that moment, the disciple took her into his home.
Thank you both very much indeed. Those are the two references to Mary of Nazareth that we find in John's Gospel. But we're focusing on the first one, of course, because that's the story of the wedding at Cana of Galilee. And where is Cana? Well, it's somewhere north of Nazareth. There are a couple of villages up there which have a claim to being this place. And I'm not very good at Palestinian pronunciation. There's a village called Cana, which is about 8 miles north of Nazareth, and another called Cana, which is about 4.5 miles from Nazareth, and they're likely contenders for the location. There are other nearby possibilities too. All are within a few miles of Nazareth. Therefore, the people around would have been acquainted with the family of Mary and of Jesus. Other associations with the place are Nathanael the apostle came from Cana. We read this in the 21st chapter of John's Gospel at verse 2. This is Nathanael, who's otherwise known in Matthew's Gospel probably as Bartholomew. And it was also in Cana of Galilee that Jesus heard from the royal official whose son was ill. That story comes in chapter 4 of the Gospel. And interestingly, that story, the healing of the son of the royal official, is the second miraculous sign. The turning of water into wine is the first one performed by Jesus. And those of you who like looking at maps, as I do, you will have noticed that most of the scenes of Jesus' Galilean ministry are all located in a relatively small area, sort of northwest of the Sea of Tiberias, Lake Galilee. And Mary is presented as a key figure in this first miraculous sign of Jesus. But it is interesting that John refers to her simply as the mother of Jesus. He doesn't refer to her by name. The other gospel writers do refer to her as Mary, but John calls her the mother of Jesus. Kenneth Bailey, who has written Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, he's also written a book called Paul Through Middle Eastern Eyes. Kenneth Bailey says that the mother-son relationship is a very important one in Middle Eastern society. And to refer to Mary as the mother of Jesus is something important to do. She's not divorced from this relationship with her son, nor he from her. She's the person through whom this first miraculous sign happened, the go-between, the person going to Jesus and then to the servants. And so she's seen here in this story as very much a catalyst in Jesus' ministry coming to fruition, just as she was the means for the incarnation to happen, as is recorded by Matthew and Luke. Without Mary, what might have happened? Important she is, clearly, but only twice in Scripture do we hear words that she has said. We hear more from other women, and certainly more from other men, but only twice in Scripture do we hear words of Mary's. And once is in Luke's Gospel, where she says, "I am the Lord's servant, may it be to me as you have said." And here in this incident recorded by John, they have no more wine, and then to the servants, do what he tells you. A word to Jesus, stating the situation. A word to the servants, seeking to resolve that situation. And I think it's significant to notice that each of these two occasions, in Luke and in John, each of these two occasions is one which highlights faithful obedience in unlikely circumstances. Pregnant without a father? No more wine, just water? So her obedience to God is immediate and it is faithful. Some commentators argue a little about how Jesus addresses her. Woman. Is he being rude? Is he being dismissive? Is he being harsh? But in chapter 19 of John's Gospel and verse 26, we hear her referred to as dear woman. And it's interesting to notice that John tends to use this form of address in respect of women elsewhere in his Gospel. Jesus will address the woman at the well as woman. Jesus will address Mary of Magdala at the tomb as woman. And it's been suggested that in speaking like this to Mary, Jesus is releasing himself from the family bond and into ministry, and releasing her from the family bond into discipleship. She's no longer simply his mother. She's a disciple, a follower. And it seems clear in her words to the servants that she recognizes this. And Jesus tells her quite clearly, my hour is not yet come. And of course, this is the word used here, I understand, is kairos, which means significant moment, rather than chronos, which is clock time. It's not time to give you more wine, but my time, my significant time has not come. I suppose as good law-abiding Methodists, we have lost a sense of how appalling it must have been for the host at this feast, this wedding feast, to run out of wine. A lack of wine was an indication of a serious deficit in hospitality and a source of great shame. added to this, Middle Eastern wedding feasts could and still do go on for a couple of days. So to run out of wine at this stage was an appalling situation for any family to find itself in. But we notice how Jesus handles the event and creates 6 flagons of wine, a vast amount of wine, a superabundance of wine. And this motif, if you like, of superabundance finds itself very frequently in John's Gospel. For example, when we have John's account of the picnic by Lake Galilee, the 5 loaves and 2 fishes that we see in her cheese picture, there are, from having nothing, there are 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. There is so much. We read that the woman brings a pound of perfume to anoint Jesus' feet. This is in chapter 12. A pound of perfume. It says in the New International Version, a pint. And we know that's a lot of perfume. We find at Jesus' burial that 100 pounds of spices are brought to anoint, to preserve his body. And we're told in that final picture of a picnic at Lake Galilee in the 21st chapter of John, that there were 153 fish caught, far more than 12 men needed for breakfast. So John has this picture of the overflowing generosity of God when God intervenes, when God is present, this overwhelming generosity. If, as Charles Wesley put it, enough for all, enough for each, enough for evermore in the provision of Jesus. And in the second few pieces, verses, we read that Jesus' hour has now come. And he says so in verse 13, chapter 13, verse 1, his hour is coming. And in this hour, he recognizes that this woman disciple is his mother, and he cares for her. And so we find in Mary, I think, someone who broke a number of the traditional boundaries, someone who was a person who facilitated the sending of God's Son, the one whom he so loved, into the world that all might be saved. The one who, in a particular way, partook in the ministry of Jesus through her faithful and trusting obedience. And through that obedience, she was a boundary breaker. Her trusting obedience facilitated the coming of the Son of God, her Son. And her trust in his power facilitated this early sign, this first sign of his earthly ministry. And so as we reflect on, I think it's important to reflect on Mary of Nazareth, quite apart from the Christmas stories, because so often we think of her in Matthew, where she meets the angel, where she gives birth to the child, where she receives the wise persons from the east, where she, with Joseph, flee with the child to Egypt. Yes, we know those stories. We celebrate those stories at Christmas. Similarly, at Christmas, we celebrate Mary giving birth to the child where there was no room at the inn, the shepherds coming, and Mary realizing all this about the child and keeping them in her heart. But she's a Christmas woman. Really, from about the time we send our Christmas cards to the time we take them down, about 6 weeks, perhaps, maybe fewer, we don't actually think of Mary a lot. And so it seemed to me that to look at the other references in the gospel to her is a corrective. Possibly coming from the church, among the churches of the Reformations, we have overcorrected an emphasis on Mary that is seen on, sometimes misseen, in the Orthodox tradition and in the Roman Catholic tradition. We think perhaps they put too much emphasis on Mary. Perhaps we even misperceive that they worship Mary. Kind of reaction. We don't take her on board, except now, except at Christmas. And so I offer you this story of Mary to reflect on and to think about under certain headings. And Ruth will give us the questions in a minute when she breaks us into groups, but just to look at those and think about them. I wonder if we might discuss the place or the lack of place of Mary, the mother of Jesus. The churches of the Reformations. And I say Reformations advisedly, because the Reformation was not a date, an event. It was a process. And as the late Geoffrey Wainwright, formerly of your connection, would have asked, is the Reformation over yet? Possibly not. And allied to that, how comfortable do you feel about discussing Mary's place in the story of our faith? We are at International Women's Day today, so it's a good time to reflect on Mary, the 8th of March. But might the Feast of the Annunciation, which our sisters and brothers in other traditions commemorate on March the 25th, exactly 9 months before Christmas, women among us will note, the Feast of the Annunciation, might this be a good time to recommit ourselves to God? May it be to me according to your will, may it be to me as you have said. Might this be our prayer? And then maybe on a more personal note, you might like to reflect on Mary's trust that Jesus could redeem an awkward situation. Has this ever happened for you? Have you had to put an unquestioning trust either in the Lord or a human being put by your way by the Lord? And how did that feel?